I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Today we present Session 4 of Doing the Right Thing, an exploration of ethics with Brit Hume, Robert George, and Chuck Colson. As with the other sessions, this episode was filmed in front of a student audience. Today the panel deals with the very thorny issues involved in healthcare and life and death decisions. Is there such a thing as a life not worth living? Let's get right to Session 4. What does it mean to be human? Here is series host Brit Hume.
Already in the first three sessions, we've talked about the ethical and moral crisis in American life, how there is a moral law, and we're able to know it. And third, how we behave in a way that while knowing what's right, we also do what's right. Join us while the panel and the students discuss this issue. Our panel today has an additional member, Dr. Scott Ray, professor of philosophy of religion and ethics at Biola University's Talbot School of Theology. Dr. Ray is respected in the field of medical and business ethics. He joins our other panelist, Michael Miller of the Acton Institute, Dr. Robert George, professor of jurisprudence here at Princeton, Charles Colson, founder of Prison Fellowship and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and Dr. Glenn Sunshine of Central Connecticut University. Today we're going to be discussing the ethical implications of how we treat one another as human beings. These are pressing questions, particularly at a time when medical costs are rising and increasing numbers of people are in need of services. How do we decide who gets treated and who does not? Who makes the decisions, and what are the standards we follow? This is nothing less than the question of life and death for each one of us. This question was posed in the flash of a second on a battlefield in a distant land when Dr. Ken Swan, then a field doctor in Vietnam, was the triage surgeon receiving critically injured soldiers. Here's Dr. Swan.
The triage officer should be your most experienced, most senior in terms of judgment. Triage officer does not treat, does not touch a patient. He only gets fed information. So you walk down the line, tell me about your patient, tell me about your patient, tell me about your patient. We decide who goes to the operating room first, who goes immediately, who goes to expectant, who goes to walking wounded. I was the SOD, surgeon of the day. So I was sitting in a back room actually having coffee with the nurses, just small talk, and the nurse came running in and she said, "Doc, we got a very badly injured guy out here. You better come out right away." So I went out and took a look at him, and he was lying in a stretcher, and he was really badly injured. And he was, just one look at him, I could see his lower extremities were bad. And there were sticks and cigarette butts in him and all kinds of garbage. And I talked to him and I said, "How you doing, Ken?" His name was the same as mine, so I picked up on it. He said, "Well, I think I left my legs in the helicopter, Doc." And I remember saying to myself, and I wrote it down in a letter I sent my wife, he might just as well have left them in the helicopter because they're no good. He had a wound in his left eye, and he had an injury to his fifth finger, and his right testicle was injured. And his elbows, his upper extremities, elbows were badly fractured. But his vital signs were intact and fairly normal. He needed to have both lower extremities amputated. He needed, as we found out from radiograms, what had gone in here was now inside his skull, so in his frontal lobe, so he needed a craniectomy and debridement of his brain, and he needed to have this eye taken out. And so he needed the urologist, we need the neurosurgeon, the orthopedic surgeon, myself, and we went to work. It took, we say, about 6 hours to get all that done. Well, after we'd finished, the chief of professional services, a lieutenant colonel, when he put his arm around me and said, "Brother Kenneth, I think you should know that the boys think maybe you should have let that fellow go last night." I was sort of, oh my God, I never even thought of that. Never even thought about it. And I was very defensive, and I said, well, I was trained to take care of the sick and the wounded. God will decide who lives or dies. And I stuck by that until I realized that, no, he was right and I was wrong, because I don't have that much experience. The chaplain's assistant He said, I just want to let you know that Kenny made it home. My parents wrote me and told me. And then I realized, oh my God, I sort of thought he was going to succumb. And the fact that he's now back home, that meant, where is he going to be? What's going to happen to him? And he was from a farm area in Alabama. And I pictured him with mother and father in a farmhouse in a back room, blind and confined to bed, and probably cigarette ashes all over him and a can of beer next to him or something like that. And I thought how hideous that was.
An agonizing question there. Chuck?
I wrote about Dr. Swan in one of my books, How Now Should We Live, because I saw on television the joyous reunion with Ken McGarty when he came back and discovered that the man he had saved was living a full life and was married and had children. So, in my mind, at least he made the right decision, even though his commanding officer chastised him for it, and even though Dr. Swan would tell you to this day that he has doubts about whether he really did the right thing. But that's an awkward situation. That's the most morally difficult situation anybody ever faces. Robbie?
He did the right thing, and I don't think that he should have any doubts. At the foundation of our thinking about ethics is the basic principle that every human being, regardless of how rich or poor, intelligent or not so intelligent, robust and healthy or severely debilitated, possesses a profound, inherent, and equal dignity and a right to life. So we must never suppose that there are some lives unworthy of being lived, that there are lives unworthy of life, that there are useless eaters, that there are people who are better off dead.
But even if you accept that, I mean, the choice is not often between whether to let some one person live or die. It's whether how to allocate the scarce resources at your disposal. Even if you accept that every one of these people who may be lying there and needed treatment is in the image of God and equally deserving of life.
Dr. Scott Ray responds.
I think those are two different uses of the idea of triage. What Dr. Swan, I think, referred to as the normal way that triage is done, that's a medical decision about how to allocate scarce resources when you can't save everybody. And those are medical decisions based on the likelihood of survival. Robbie, what you're referring to is a different sort of triage where the basis on which those judgments are made are value judgments about the value of a person. And that's a different sort of decision that we have to make today.
Michael Miller chimes in.
I think that Professor Ray is correct. I mean, the existence of life, because we're created in the image and likeness of God, because we have inherent dignity, life is valuable whether we are productive or not. And when we start to reduce things to productivity or to utility, then we go from a situation of scarce resources in a battlefield to now thinking purely utilitarian means, a cost-benefit analysis, whether we should say, for example, elderly people who've had a stroke or Down
Dr.
syndrome.
Glenn Sunshine joins in.
And actually, that's not very different from Dr. Swan's situation. He specified that there was some routine care going on, but there was no one else coming in that was injured. So it wasn't a matter of deciding to treat him and leaving someone else untreated. It was a question of whether he was worth treating at all.
Right, because which gets us back to your point, which is that all other things being equal, and in this case, apparently all other things were equal. The question is whether to let someone die or not, and that's it.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the real question confronting us as a culture and as a polity. Either we are going to stick at the basis of our ethics and at the base of our medicine with the proposition that every human being has profound, inherent, and equal dignity, or we're going to abandon that in favor of the view that was once associated with the movement known as eugenics, which distinguished some people as superior and other people as inferior and favored those who were allegedly superior over the inferior. Now, the eugenics movement got a bad name because of its association with the Nazis. The idea of Lebens unwertes Leben, lives unworthy of life. You know what the Nazis did to lives they thought were unworthy of life. But what people forget is that the Nazis didn't invent that doctrine. They picked it up. The doctrine was invented not by these thugs, but by well-educated, polite, liberal-thinking people, progressives, people like Huck and Binding, who wrote the book, Lives Unworthy of Life. They were a doctor and a lawyer in Germany in the Weimar Republic before the rise of the Nazis, who promoted the eugenics idea. It also became very popular in the United States, not among thuggish people, but in the elite sector of the culture. No less than Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great American jurist and Supreme Court justice, in a famous case called Buck against Bell, endorsed the eugenics doctrine by saying, with respect to the forced sterilization of a woman who was thought to be mentally disabled, that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Well, eugenics suffered from having a bad name because of its association with the Nazis for a long time, but it's back. And we now face the question, are we going to buy it or not buy it? And we have to resist that with all our might.
There is another aspect to this ethical dilemma, and it goes to the question of whether what you might decide to do may harm others. Father Robert Sirico has examined this question. What if your actions to do good actually cause harm to someone else? After that, we'll hear a very personal view on the subject of caring for those with significant physical handicaps. Father Sirico.
The doctor would treat the most urgent situation, the person perhaps nearest death but not yet dead. And in the process of treating that person, other people may be waiting for the treatment and may in fact die as a result of the good that the doctor is doing. Now, that might have been foreseen but not intended, and there was a certain risk, a certain amount of prudence that was required in order to make that priority. And so the principle of double effect never allows one to choose an evil, but to choose a good, understanding that an evil may actually result as a kind of side issue. It's important to understand that the principle of double effect is not a utilitarian consideration. It is based on objective moral norms and goods.
We now hear from Johnny Erickson Tata.
When I first became spinal cord injured and realized my quadriplegia was total and permanent, at first I didn't want to live. I mean, I think that's because back then I was way too influenced by the things that society values, like appearance, abilities, whether or not I could contribute, whether or not I could walk or run. Yet, even though I could not use my hands or legs, I was still the same person. I was still me. And my instinctive desire to live far outweighed my despair. And that's when I began to look into the Bible. I had to understand why I still prized my life. And the Bible showed me that it centered on my being created by a God of intent and compassion. This wasn't any accident. This was his plan. And my dignity as a human being was directly linked to God. Society may say that it extols human dignity, but it does not, it cannot. Because when you take God out of the picture, we're not even glorified animals. And that spells bad news for people with disabilities. Quadriplegics like me have never fared well in societies that view life as dispensable. When society attaches life value to, how a person functions or what they can contribute or do, then people with severe disabilities or the elderly or anyone who's weak, their lives are at risk. So not only must life not be destroyed, it must be honored. And the way we treat those who are weak is a reflection of what we value. And if we prize the God of all creation, we will value the life he's made.
This issue is very personal to some of us. I have a 19-year-old autistic grandson who, if Dr. Peter Singer here at Princeton, who believes in a utilitarian calculus for determining who lives and who dies, had his way, would have been killed the moment he was born. So I take it very personally because I've seen how Max, my grandson, has affected the lives of thousands of people. He's a great blessing. He's transformed our whole family. He's taught us about love in a whole new dimension. And Johnny Erickson Tata, you just saw, has done, over the last 40 years, the most remarkable work around the world. I've gone all over the world and seen Johnny's wheelchairs, the program she has started to help other people with disabilities. We haven't the power to play God. Dr. Swan did the right thing. Sirico gave us the right explanation. That is, it's our intention that matters, and we must never fall into the trap that we fell into in this country earlier this century, and that is eugenics. That's exactly what Robbie said. That's the alternative.
So let's open this up to the students. Yes, in the back.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the panel for this interesting discussion. I think it's a really important issue. Over 10 million children die each year from largely preventable causes. This is children under the age of 5. They don't have access to services or any way to access the medical technologies that could save their lives. So I guess my question for the panel is, what can we do to make sure that ability to pay doesn't triage so many human beings out of access to health services, and what should we do?
Go ahead.
Well, one of the things that we need to do is organize our healthcare systems in such a way as to make fundamental healthcare that's really necessary, available to people as broadly as possible, irrespective of ability to pay. Now, there are some people who might actually just rush to the judgment from that premise that means we should have the government run the healthcare system. We should socialize medicine. I suspect that most of those people haven't lived under socialized medicine, which I happened to do when I lived in England for 5 years. I can tell you the story of a dear friend of mine whose name is Nancy Brown, she was a dishwasher in New College, Oxford. I got to know her very well when I was a lecturer there. Nancy died waiting online for a routine mastectomy that would have saved her life, despite my efforts on her behalf when I went up to the Radcliffe Hospital and demanded to speak to the person in charge and started throwing furniture around because this woman was waiting on a list. So we shouldn't rush to any conclusions about exactly how we should organize the system, and certainly we shouldn't rush to the conclusion that we should have a government-run healthcare system in order to bring healthcare to as many people as possible. Now we have a lot of questions that are of a different nature, questions about economics, questions about sociology, prudential judgments that need to be made for which the moral propositions will not provide answers just by themselves.
But somehow, in this new environment we're facing, decisions are going to have to be made about who gets treated and how much and how well and who does not. So how do we adapt the concept that all life is precious and all human beings are equal before God in this new world?
Scott Ray responds.
Well, I think for one, you can affirm that all life is precious and has value, but at the same time not affirm that it's the highest good. And so, theologically speaking, from a Christian worldview, if death is a conquered enemy, then it need not always be resisted. And under certain circumstances, it is appropriate to say enough to certain treatments that only delay.
But who gets to make, I've made that call myself in my own life when my mother, dying of cancer, could have been kept going for an indefinite period of time. We all know about such cases. And a rational and I think even a Christian decision can be made to say, okay, enough is enough. But who gets to make that call? In the case that I described, that's family. Family, my father and I made that good decision. But decisions are going to be made along these lines. Who gets to make them?
The danger comes, and I think we're coming perilously close to us, where somebody else is going to make that decision for us. In fact, practically speaking, in fetal care cases now in hospitals, that decision is being taken out of the hands of the family. We've got to guard against this.
Unfortunately now, the concept of futility is being manipulated by those who do not cling to an ethic of the sanctity of human life to authorize what is in effect killing people. So we need to be very, very careful moving.
Michael Miller again.
I mean, I just would agree with that. I think that's the danger. I mean, life has sanctity, it has dignity, and we don't have the right to take our own lives or the life of our mother, father, brother, sister. And so there's even a dangerous area where we're treading when you say, who's going to be able to make the decision? I mean, this is fundamentally a problem with government running healthcare because it takes a utilitarian approach. But even the family has to make a decision, as Professor George said, in light of the truth about the human person. And this goes back to the whole discussion that we've had throughout these panels about how a proper understanding of who the human person is and what the person is in relationship to others and to society. If we lose that, and we are losing that, it becomes very, very dangerous, especially for certain groups, the unborn, the elderly, and the disabled.
One question that's raised is whether, as As Governor Richard Lamb famously said, the old have a duty to die. Dr. Chris Hook of the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, has a story about just how complicated medical ethics can become in an age where the unimaginable has become possible. New questions are raised and old issues that many had thought were settled return.
The eugenics movement did not go away. It really changed how it expressed itself with the explosion of genetic information through the Human Genome Project. The use of that information for reproductive choice, and that's not just necessarily to abort or to not implant embryos, but to whether or not to conceive children in the first place and consider adoption or other things. That information is going to be used. There has been the use of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to allow certain normal individuals to live while other normal embryos were discarded. I'll give you an example. In 2001, there was a case of a young woman, a little girl, who had an inherited bone marrow problem called Fanconi's anemia. The best way to cure this was through a matched sibling bone marrow transplant. And you could get from a non-sibling donor, but there would be other immunologic consequences and elements of that. So her parents went and conceived roughly 30 embryos through in vitro fertilization. They first checked them for the presence or absence of the Fanconi's anemia gene, discarded those that had the defect. They then did testing to see if the embryos were going to be a perfect match for the young girl. And even though they were normal, if they weren't a match, they were discarded. And that left 4, and then they did single embryo transfers, and ultimately a brother was born who served as a bone marrow donor. Now, on one sense, one can certainly understand the desires of a parent to do what they could to save their child. But when we engage in something like that, we have already subscribed to utilitarian calculus that says it's okay to let us use genetic information to determine whether some people can exist for the use of others or don't have the right to exist at all. And so eugenics is very much alive and well. It's just being expressed in different ways.
So the question arises, can we or should we destroy life to create life? That's in part what embryonic stem cell research is all about. Gentlemen?
Well, the first thing I think that we have to be clear about is that a human embryo is in fact a human being at a very early stage of development, but it's not a non-human creature or a subhuman creature. Each of us who is today an adult was at an earlier stage of his or her life, an adolescent, and before that a child, and before that a newborn infant, and before that a fetus, and before that an embryo. These terms don't name different things or different kinds of things. They name the same kind of thing, indeed the same thing, that is a human being at different stages of development. So we're talking about the taking of human life here, which Dr. Hook admirably made very clear. If you want to know what a human embryo is, just look at any of the textbooks that are used in human medicine and anatomy, and you'll see what it is. The real question is, are we willing to sacrifice the lives of some human beings for the sake of others? And that means, are we willing to give up the sanctity of human life ethic in favor of an ethics of eugenics?
Dr. Sunshine.
2 things here. One of them is frequently people will make a distinction between, okay, it's a biologically human organism, but it's not a person. And the people who make that distinction will then promptly say that people who are pro-life are introducing their own philosophy or theology into the discussion. Those two don't really go together, because as soon as you distinguish between a human organism and a person, you're the one who's bringing in philosophical categories. The argument from the pro-life side is that this is a biological human being. That is a scientific fact. And as a biological human being, it has rights.
But as a matter of law, it has been treated by the courts, if I understand it correctly, as a question of when is personhood, as you just mentioned, achieved? When is that reached? And that seems to me to be the basis on which the courts are now treating this. Go ahead.
I mean, that is one of the fundamental problems. If we accept the biological reality that an embryo is a human being, so then the question becomes what makes a person? And so then we're at a purely arbitrary definition of what it means to be a person. And we go back to the question of who decides. It's power. So, for example, some people define unborn children as non-persons, right? Well, if that person, let's say another person defined a certain minority group as non-persons. We know that the German National Socialists defined Jews as non-persons and homosexuals and invalids as non-persons. Well, the problem is, this goes back to that you have no ground to stand on to say why the Nazi is wrong to define Jewish or homosexual or invalid out of their personhood. And so it ends up becoming a consensus or something else, but consensus does not equal truth.
Go ahead.
And to take this a step beyond the Nazis, I want to go back to Rome. In ancient Rome, the 12 tables of law, which are the foundation for Roman law, said that every handicapped child that was born had to be killed. When Christianity came along, they opposed abortion and infanticide, coming out of the Jewish tradition, actually, on this point. And actually, the first time that Christians ever appealed to the Roman government, in the midst of persecution of Christians, the first legal appeal they made to the Roman government wasn't to stop persecution, it was to stop killing innocent babies. It was to stop infanticide and abortion as legal murder. What people don't understand is that the opposition to abortion and infanticide stems from precisely the same ideas that lead the early Christians to oppose slavery, to promote women and the position of women in the communities, to support the general ideas that will emerge as the Western tradition of human rights.
I think we have to have the candor to say that we don't need to go to the Nazis or even to the ancient Romans to see a society that dehumanizes some people by distinguishing human being from person. Look at the Dred Scott decision in the United States just before the Civil War in the 1850s, when Supreme Court justices, Brit, a majority, opinion by Chief Justice Thorny, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, essentially ruled that our African American brothers and sisters, though in fact they were human beings from a biological point of view, did not have the full rights of human beings.
Sorry, Britt, one other thing you said, maybe I'm changing direction here, but you asked, what are we going to do? And I think one thing we have to realize is that we can never do an evil to attain a good. I mean, this is a fundamental moral problem, that if we think we can do evil to attain some good, then ultimately we're playing God, and we'll have no idea of the consequences that could come from that evil.
That's right. A view like Professor Singer's supposes that there is a distinction between human beings and persons. To his credit, Professor Singer does concede that the child in the womb or in the petri dish is a human being. Doesn't deny that, doesn't try to run away from it, as so many do. Professor Singer doesn't think that an infant has a moral right to life. There's not a moral argument against infanticide. There might be political considerations, there might be other considerations, but infanticide in itself isn't morally wrong. And he thinks that there are some post-personal human beings, that is, human beings who once were persons, but because of dementia or being in a coma or a persistent vegetative state or minimally conscious state, are no longer persons. And of course, he believes that there are some human beings who are not now, never were, and never will be persons, severely mentally handicapped individuals.
I think this discussion is the most important one you can engage in ethics today. Unfortunately, a lot of people put slogans and catchphrases like pro-life, pro-choice. It's much deeper than that. The question is, what does it mean to be human? And we live in an environment today, the emergency regulations put out for the flu epidemic, right in the beginning said, in the case of an epidemic, when medical resources are scarce, we'll do the greatest good for the greatest number. That sounds plausible, but it is deadly dangerous.
There are, as all this suggests, no easy answers here, particularly in this complex age with genetic and biological research proceeding so rapidly. But if this discussion doesn't establish anything else, it does clearly indicate that this is one of the major issues that Americans must consider. It's one which involves every single person in the most intimate way. Join us in the next session as we discuss the ethics of business and commerce.
Shane Morris here again. Thanks for listening to the Breakpoint podcast and our special presentation of Chuck Colson's and Robert George's series, Doing the Right Thing. Join us next week for Part 5, Ethics in the Marketplace. And if you're interested in purchasing the Doing the Right Thing DVD series, please come to our online bookstore at breakpoint.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.